questions as we think about the rule of law. Can you all see the slides, more or less? Right in the middle? Okay, it's okay. As we talk about the rule of law, one of the things that's become quite clear, and it's quite clear in the literature, and I think it's also been quite clear here, is that rule of law is a hooray kind of word, and there are lots of different strands of meaning. We've been through some of them over the last day, and then again this morning, whether rule of law is thick or thin, and whether its purpose is to reduce arbitrariness, control power, make state action predictable. These are all, I was looking through the kind of lists that people came up with yesterday, and they're all kind of centering on a set of common values. You can see why there's a common conception. But I think what I would add from this morning's panel, which was really helpful, is that the rule of law, despite its ancient lineage, you can find references to it in works of political theory and legal theory going back some time. Its practical value as an actual legal concept with some bite is actually relatively new. And so one of the things that I would like to propose as a kind of theoretical move, and then I'll show you why I think it matters, is that a lot of what's covered by this concept of the rule of law is covered, it seems to me, equally well and perhaps better by the concept of constitutionalism, which has, it seems to me, a number of virtues. Now, actually, just to explain the picture, you probably recognize everybody, but in case you don't, it's Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, and Viktor Orban. And I will talk a lot about Hungary today. And I think that the question here, this playing with fear question, has to do with a kind of sense that there's a new form of politics, which is kind of a winner-take-all politics that destroys much of the kind of balance that we think the rule of law stands for. But I think in some ways the rule of law is not as effective as constitutionalism in thinking through what the general issues are. This is a cartoon, if you can read it, where it says, do you ever have one of those days when everything seems unconstitutional, one judge says to another? And we're sort of in that state now with some countries, where sort of everything they're doing is a problem. And so the question is, can you actually, if you have a country which doesn't, is rule of law a concept about a system, or is it a concept about individual moves within a system? Right? The concept of constitutionalism strikes me as actually better representing what we mean by this and why. So, first of all, constitutionalism does have, I think, a reasonably well-agreed conceptual framework, that it involves separating the rules of the game from the game. And that many of the things that we think of as rule of law violations, some of them are handleable within a constitutional system. There's a day when everything looks unconstitutional, but it's within a frame that's well known. And then there's this question of what happens when constitutional frames are changed, which is that's a different kind of rule of law issue, more systemic, as it were. And I think that a lot of the threats that we're looking at now are of this more systemic kind. But rule of law doesn't really distinguish between the systemic and the incidental, as it were. And so this is where I think constitutionalism, when you firmly distinguish the rules of the game from the game, is a framework that allows us to understand these things. And also, I think it solves some of the problem of whether the rule of law is thick or thin and which things it actually covers. Because, of course, in the history and debates over constitutionalism, there are certain standard themes that emerge as being more or less the agreed-upon consensus of what constitutionalism covers. And it involves checked power, so there is no power without some check, and that can be a judicial check. But in many systems like Britain and in large measure the US and sort of Commonwealth model systems generally tend to de-emphasize judicial checks in favor of political checks, but that's okay as long as they're checks. So constitutionalism is committed to a system of checks, but neutral on sort of exactly how they're exercised. I think constitutionalism is also deeply committed not just to checks on power, but rotation of power. The possibility for rotation of power, which gets to some of the democratic values that we were trying to grasp for yesterday, that when you have a rotation of power, the question is how does it do that? And the answer would be, first of all, within a well-understood framework, and second of all, preferably also with voice and participation. And finally, of course, also constitutionalism over a long history stands for the evolution and protection of rights. So, I think that actually, I've been just talking about constitutionalism instead of rule of law, in part because I think it better captures the thought that there is a political framework within which these rule of law violations happen. And I think most of our problems in trying to define the rule of law come from trying to separate the law part from the politics part. But that's because partly we have this conception that law is the regular judicial expert thing, and politics, who knows? Those of us who are lawyers, it's not our field, and we can't really control it. So rule of law is an effort to kind of salvage political reconstruction from politics. But constitutionalism already finds a way to regulate both politics and law in a larger frame. And if you think about constitutionalism as the frame instead of rule of law, what you get is the sense that rules of the game cover both politics and law. If you don't have the frame, you don't see how to separate them or how they relate to each other. And so constitutionalism as a bigger frame, it seems to me, helps sort out a lot of the confusions that we see in the rule of law. So my title for today is actually so I could do a whole lecture on that. And I'm happy to take questions on it. But I want to push this idea a little bit further by talking about this idea of a counter-constitution. It's quite similar to what Jack Balkin has talked about as a shadow constitution. If you think about a shadow government, say in the UK, it's the one ready to stand in when the first one leaves. So these alternative governments are well known. But many constitutional systems, particularly really robust ones, the opposition, deep opposition, will frame itself as a counter-constitution. So there's opposition within a constitutional frame, which is loyal opposition and all the concepts that we know and understand and recognize not as threats to a constitutional order. And then there are just revolutions and coups that throw out a constitutional order without having any particular constitutional aspirations. We know that case well. What I'm trying to look at is an intermediate case between loyal opposition and complete revolution, which is this idea of a counter-constitution, where you get a polity that becomes extremely divided and polarized, where in some ways the fights between the various camps can't actually be reconciled fully within the existing constitutional frame, where they disagree so much about the nature and the identity of the constitutional state that the opposition speaks in terms of an alternative constitution rather than alternatives within a constitution. Now, I want to say that that's not as bad as some things from a rule of law standpoint, because when you have the opposition talking in constitutional terms, even if it's not your constitution, but is some substitute one, you at least are all talking about the same kind of thing. And so I think this is it reflects, as I say, the hegemony of the idea. Constitutionalism itself is still not challenged. What's challenged is the particular version of it. So you can have conflict within the frame of constitutionalism by having substitute constitutions be under discussion in a given very polarized politics. Okay, so this is my introduction. So after this, I'm going to tell you probably way more than you want to know about Hungary, but part of the reason is because I couldn't resist the invitation of the conference to actually take history seriously. And also I saw that there were so many EU papers, and you're also knowledgeable about EU law, and you know Hungary's problems under EU law. And I think the conclusion that to reach from the many very good papers on the subject and the references to Hungary that have come up is that the EU is not going to be very well positioned to fix this problem. Partly because a lot of what Hungary is doing wrong is not something that the EU takes to be its central responsibilities. And partly also because within the EU, we have this sort of rule of law problem in which the council is sort of lawless in the sense that, does it have to enforce Article 2? Does it have to enforce Article 7? There's this point of kind of political discretion, unregulated political discretion, that is one of the reasons why the EU has not been dealing with either Hungary or with Poland. And so I think ultimately that these countries are going to have to fix themselves. Which is what any democratic state under the rule of law should do anyway. So I'm showing you a picture of an object. This is the Holy Crown of St. Stephen. And I wanted to explain its role in Hungarian constitutional history as, well, as you can see, as the historic constitution of Hungary. The crown is actually a physical object. If you've been to Budapest lately, you've seen that it's in the Parliament building. It used to be in the National Museum. It's a physical object. It's the oldest continually operating crown in Europe, which is actually saying something. It was allegedly given by the Pope to Hungary's first Christian king, Stephen, in the year 1000. And so it purports to be a crown that is more than 1,000 years old. Now, it's called the Constitution, and what I love about this is that it requires a kind of anthropological investigation, because we're used to having constitutions be words on paper. If not in a single document, then in multiple documents, but of course, and in the Netherlands or in the UK, where the Constitution is also a set of historical understandings that are not necessarily fully written down, this is not such a mysterious concept. And Hungary really belongs to the family of countries whose constitution needs to be understood as a process of historical development and not as the succession of texts. Now, what I'm going to do today, first I want to show you a lot of pictures because there's just a ton of crown pictures out there, and you're going to get sick of looking at the Holy Crown. But at the end, I'll show you the actual crown itself. These are all models and pictures and representations of the crown. And so what I'm going to do today is both tell you about some of the scholarship I've worked on over the last 20 years on the Holy Crown of St. Stephen. It's really an endless topic, but I won't tell you endlessly about it. And to show you sort of what the Holy Crown stands for as the historic constitution of Hungary. But also what I'm actually engaged in here is subversion. And by subversion, I mean that, as some of you know, I've been a critic of the current Hungarian government, and I'm very involved in things there. I get death threats, so I don't post so often anymore. But I'm also trying to make a concrete intervention in the politics of the place. And so the scholarship that I'm about to describe to you is also a remedy for how Hungarians can pull themselves out of this mess. And you actually heard a little preamble of it in Vlad's talk, because when the Hungarian Constitutional Court decided the judicial retirement case, they have this long thing on the historic constitution of Hungary. I might say I had a little bit to do with that because I helped with the research for that, because under the new constitution, this historic constitution is referenced. So the historic constitution is in this dreadful new Fidesz constitution, and so as you'll see, where I'm going to go with this is towards saying, well, what is this historic constitution, and does it have any resources for pulling this bad new constitution in a better direction? So this is ultimately where I'm going. So what I'm going to do today is give you a Hungarian constitutional history, because it's hard to describe this thing in the abstract. And rather than start from the beginning and go until the future, I'm going to start with now and go backwards. By first describing a little bit about this constitutional revolution that's been done since 2010, then flash back to what the government thinks it's doing with history and the kind of historical reference that it's bringing up when it does this constitutional revolution, and then I'll show you the references I wish they would make, which will turn out to be weirdly movable, and then I'll tell you about the crown itself. So I'm going to start the narrative by starting in 1978. Which was when the U.S., which had come into possession of the Holy Crown of St. Stephen at the end of the Second World War. There's a really funny story asking the questions, but I won't tell you now. The U.S. had the Holy Crown of St. Stephen in Fort Knox, which is the place where the U.S. stores its gold reserves. And I see where it is, somewhere there. And so in 1978, partly as a way of trying to stir up nationalist passions in Hungary, Jimmy Carter decided to return it to Hungary, because hoping that it would make Hungarians realize that their real fate was not with the Soviet Union, trying to create another uprising. Excuse me, and the government had hardly refused to take it, because under the traditional, historic constitution, sovereignty rests in the crown. And so one of the arguments had been that the Soviet regime was illegal because it was set up at a time when the crown was out of the country. So you got to bring the crown back. So this is actually Air Force One bringing back the crown. And then it was put in this National Museum, which it had its own separate room and its own separate guard and so forth. And basically, it didn't stir much nationalist passion. And after the first few weeks, it didn't even attract many crowds. But in 1989, some things happened. These are a couple of the election posters from 1990. And actually, for those of you interested in how Fidesz, the current governing party, has changed its stripes, the right-hand poster was their very first election poster. And the question is, do you have, the kiss of the communist dictators, or, do you have freedom to do whatever, right? It implies sexual freedom, and Fidesz is not this party anymore. But anyway, these were the election posters, and so, as you all know, in 1989, the wall came down, and all of these governments decided that they were going to have to reconstitute themselves, and Hungary's constitutional revolution was actually the first in the region. Hungary got its new constitution on October 23rd, 1989. Which was about 2 weeks before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this constitution was introduced as an amendment to the Stalinist Constitution of 1949. Excuse me, it was a series of actually 200 or so amendments to the Stalinist Constitution of 1949, and its goal was to set a framework for the first free elections. It established the Constitutional Court. There were some changes made after the first free elections, things that the outgoing Communist Party wouldn't agree to, that they didn't have to agree to after the first elections. And so there was a process over a year and a half of creating a kind of model, if a little messy, because they sort of substituted articles, and so there were only 10 rights in the Soviet Constitution, there were 50 rights in the new one, so it goes through, Article 60, 61, 62, then 70, A, B, C, D, W, So the numbering was a little wrong, and it's still called the Constitution of 1949 as amended, legally speaking. So there were some messy bits, but it was basically a liberal democratic constitutional system. This was controversial, controversial in a small way from the start. The far right, the right and far right of the Hungarian political spectrum, that was free at last to say what it thought, briefly entertained bringing back the monarchy. And they also kept saying from day one, this is the time to restore the historic constitution of Hungary, and the historic constitution of Hungary is the crown. Okay, so everybody else said monarchy, although Bulgaria, also toyed with this. It might not have been such a bad idea in light of what we're now seeing, frankly. But anyway, so they toyed with this, but there was really a liberal constitution was the only thing they really considered, but the right felt really excluded from this, and they felt that Hungary's unique past had been ignored in this process. Here was an opportunity to recover Hungarian history, and it was missed. Instead, what happened was a one-size-fits-all liberal constitution that had nothing specifically Hungarian about it. So the argument about the crown actually then migrated to other things. So it migrated to symbols of state. The Parliament in 1990, instead of doing economic reform or the million other kinds of things it might have thought of, spent most of 1990 debating the national seal, which turns out to be this, with the crown. And it was a strict left-right vote in the Parliament, a foreshadowing of what was to come, but the crown won in the national seal. There was then an effort in 1995-96 to clean up the Hungarian constitution by just renumbering, redrafting, a kind of clean-up revision that wasn't going to make major substantive changes, and all the political parties put in draft constitutions, and at that point the Smallholders Party, which was the farthest right of the parliamentary parties, again insisted that the monarchy be brought back, but also insisted that the entire constitution be framed around the crown and the historic constitution of Hungary for which it stands. They lost. But then in 1998, Viktor Orbán's Fidesz party was elected, and it had to bring together the other conservative parties to form a coalition because it didn't have a majority on its own. And so in this coalition government, the smallholders had enough votes to bring down the government if they left. And they had one demand. They said, according to the historic constitution, no law is valid unless passed in the physical presence of the object. So they demanded that the crown be moved from the museum where I used to go sit there in the room with the crown for a long time because I was really fascinated with this. And I'd sit there for a whole afternoon and 2 people would come in. So it wasn't like it was really happening over the object. It was really a kind of symbolic fight. But still, they decided that the crown had to be moved to the parliament. And so it was. So this is actually a picture of the night before they're going to bring the crown on a red carpet, right, into the Parliament building. And actually what I found quite fascinating, this was a poster that was designed for the occasion, including the sort of translation, not translation, but the explanation at the bottom, which calls it the translation of the Holy Crown to the Hungarian Parliament. So anybody who knows medieval history will recognize translation, which is the transportation of a relic, is always called a translation, which is to say that it's meant to invoke the sacredness of the object. And so this is what they did. And the Parliament passes the first law of the new millennium. Remember, Stephen's crowned in the year 1000, so obviously the year 2000 is not just a millennial anniversary for the whole globe, but it's also in Hungary. And so this law was fought over, but there's a law that then just says, the Holy Crown lives in the consciousness of the nation meaning like nationalist kind of nation, and in the Hungarian public law tradition, to satisfy the liberals so they wouldn't veto it, as a relic, really relic, meaning the sacred kind of, the body part of the holy person, as a relic embodying the continuity and independence of the Hungarian state. Okay, which doesn't give it legal meaning yet. okay? But it's also not a neutral object, right? And so then it moves to the parliament. Shortly thereafter, Fidesz loses the election in 2002, and basically a culture war breaks out in Hungary. And there's this huge amount of political polarization. And what happens in the middle of the political polarization is that you start to see crowns everywhere. You see them on the internet. This is actually a statue in Buda, which is like not in the most conservative part of the city. This is a turtle, which is the mythical bird that, anyways, complicated story. But in the origin narrative of the Hungarian peoples, this bird plays a big part. There's the turtle with the crown. You see all these crown statues going up all over the place, and the left is just and actually also at that time you get the emergence of a true far right neo-Nazi party, the Jobbik, which has these uniforms. This is their paramilitary group. The uniform is the same uniforms that these paramilitaries wore in the 1930s, just to give you, and that all of their rhetoric echoes what's happening in the 30s, the Horthy regime of the 30s. Their symbol, which is this circle, is like a flattened crown, actually. So they didn't use the crown, but if you look, you'll see, because of course the Hungarian crown has this sort of bent cross. And anyway, so they use the symbol of the crown absolutely all the time. And you see, again, there were these kinds of parades in the countryside where people would have these, things of the crown. They just increased enormously. And once Fidesz was out of power, and Viktor Orban gave the speech that said the nation cannot be in opposition. Meaning, and they were, right? Because he was the nation. So there was all this whipping up of crown fervor throughout the decade. The problem is that the left, and this included the socialists, the liberals, everybody just thought like, it's a crown, for God's sake. It's not it's just an object. And it represents the monarchy, which we don't have. And they would just simply refuse to engage the conversation about the meaning of the crown. Crown has the same meaning in Hungarian as in English, so this is like the Holy Crown of St. Stephen. And the potato would represent the sort of far-right parties which had support in the countryside, and what this says is the emperor's new clothes, the crown. And so the left would, just make fun of this. You'd see on left websites, like the crown on various, unsacred objects. Anyway, in the middle of this polarization, there was a financial crisis, a lot of other problems, but the 2010 election was really a watershed election. When the electorate fled in large numbers from the left socialist liberal coalition and voted overwhelmingly for Fidesz, which was at that point the only kind of respectable party left on the right. The electorate voted 53% for Fidesz, but because of the disproportionate election law, Fidesz got 68% of the seats in the parliament. And as one of the hangovers from the 1949 Constitution that was not amended in 1989-90, the Constitution can be amended by a single two-thirds vote of the Parliament. And they had their two-thirds. So, off to the races on constitutional change. They engaged in what I've called in some of my writings a constitutional coup, which was changing the Constitution by following the procedures of the Constitution itself. As had been done, by the way, in 1889-90. So we had one flip from illiberal to liberal constitution. This was a flip back. So the Fidesz, even though they had not campaigned on the platform of starting a new constitution, immediately start this constitutional drafting process. The Constitution emerges out of thin air. We still don't actually know who wrote it. It was introduced as a private member's bill in the Parliament, which meant it bypassed all the usual safeguards of parliamentary debate and consultation. It was debated on the floor of the Parliament for 9 days, in which none of the proposals from the opposition were included, and it was passed with only the votes of the one political party. And it came along with 800 other laws in the first 4 years. They changed new civil code, criminal procedure, civil right, all these things. And what the Crown says in the Constitution, it's in the preamble. And now it says, we honor the Holy Crown, which embodies the continuity of the Hungarian constitutional state and the unity of the nation. And there's an article that says, all Hungarian law must be interpreted in light of the preamble as a legal matter. Okay? So this is why you get the Constitutional Court decision citing the historic Constitution. Okay, so now suddenly, and then they have a stamp. This is the stamp that honors the new Constitution, but it's a stamp of the Crown, not of the Constitution. Anyway, okay, so the counter-constitution, so the Crown was always portrayed from 89 on as the counter-constitution of the right. And in 2011 it wins. So, why? Okay, so I'm going to go through this really quickly. Basically, every time the far right sees the crown, they're thinking of the 20s and 30s, when Admiral Horthy, the admiral without a C, who governed as a regent without a king. Admiral Horthy, who was the regent of Hungary from 1920 to 1945, governed as a regent without a king in the name of the Holy Crown. And his regime was fused with discussions about the historic crown. There were faculty fired from the main university in Budapest for having what we would now think of as proper history about the crown. There was a whole sort of mythology about the crown that was created in the 20s and 30s. And a lot of it was because of the Treaty of Trianon, which broke up Hungary when Hungary lost 60% of its territory and 70% of its prior population. There were concepts of the crown lands and crown peoples that you find actually in medieval texts. And the idea was this was the historic constitution that provided the basis for the irredentist claims that Hungary should be reunited. This is one thing that Horthy was thinking about. In order to make those claims, Horthy and his followers built these little crown shrines in all the crown lands that were no longer Hungary. So this is one that's currently in Romania. If you ever spot one, please let me know, because there hasn't been a full mapping of these things made. That was when it opened in 1936. That's like a few years ago. And so they built these little crown shrines all over the place to claim the territory. They also then tried to build this whole mythology of the Hungarian state that involved rethinking the legend of St. Stephen, that involved using the Holy Crown to basically create this nationalistic, ethnically specific conception of the Holy Crown. Mr. Szálasi, who was the arrow cross, the Hungarian Nazi Party leader in 1944, swore an oath on the crown and was allegedly, according to this eyewitness account, transformed by it when he took the oath. I mean, it has these magical properties. And so this is Viktor Orban dressed up as Horthy. And so what you see now is that the current Hungarian government is making all kinds of what we call dog whistle references to the 20s and 30s. Dog whistle as in, if you know the history, you know exactly what they're referring to, but if you're in the European Commission, you have no clue. And they're renaming things after people from the 30s and 40s. They're putting up statues of Horthy all over the place. They're reviving anti-Semitic writers in the required school curriculum. So essentially what the crown stands for is all that. Okay. They've even brought back the uniform of the Crown Guard. It looks like a Monty Python routine, but this is what they looked like in the 30s. This is Admiral Horthy with the Crown Guard behind him. This is the new Crown Guard. They're bringing back all the uniforms from that time, all the symbols. So this is what the crown means. That's why it's there. That's why it's dangerous. That's why the Commission missed it when they reviewed the Constitution. Okay, very quickly. So I actually think the crown is a great thing to put in the Constitution because, and here's where I sort of get to my research/advocacy, because actually if you go back to the original medieval sources, it turns out the crown has a completely different history than what you've learned from the 20s and 30s that the medieval period was about. So yes, Stephen is crowned in 1000 with the crown and so forth, but it turns out, and actually this is from Kantarovich's The King's Two Bodies, which I asked about yesterday, because you all know the story of the separation of king and office and the sort of abstract nature of the power of the king from the conquered person. Okay, this doesn't happen in Hungary. It doesn't happen in Hungary because they have this object. And from the beginning, basically, sovereignty rests in the object, in the crown, and it never passes to the king. You find many references to this in medieval documents. One of these is the Golden Bull of 1222, which is a Magna Carta-like document 7 years after the Magna Carta itself, which is a pact between the nobility and the king that establishes the equality of the nobility. And I should say in Hungary, which doesn't have a fully dual system, that this is not nearly everybody, but a much wider swath of the population than was the case in almost any European country at that time. And it establishes the right of resistance, which still exists. That came up yesterday too. And this is the first pact made in the name of the Holy Crown itself. So the Holy Crown stands for limitations on the power of the king, because the nobility has the right to rise up against him if he violates the promise, the equality of the nobility, constrained power, okay? You get these references to the crown as sacred, so this is actually, I won't go through all my medieval sources, but basically this is not something you're making up now. You can go through sources and you find these references to the crown, both as sacred and as representing the sovereignty of the state independent of the king. I should say that in the eastern part of Europe, kingships are elected. It's not a hereditary monarchy. And after the original Hungarian dynasty dies out in 1300, the nobility will need to elect the king. And they almost never elect Hungarians. They elect Poles and Angevins and Czechs, and I have a few Hungarians in there, but very few. It really is a kind of, and it's clear that the king has to swear an oath on the crown in order to keep all of these promises and this continuity of the legal system going. If the crown is associated with miracles, ask me about them, with the time when it was stolen from the castle. This is my favorite, so this is a quotation from the Italian court historian for the Hungarian king at the end of the 15th century, when he says, "Even an ox, once you see it embellished with the holy crown, must be honored with respect and treated as an inviolate saintly king." Okay, this is like late 15th century, so this is not a new thing, right? And the crown is clearly the thing that stands for the state. This is the first codification of Hungarian law in which you find the concepts of crown peoples, crown lands, and this idea that sovereignty rests in the crown and not with the king. This is something which I'm still actually working on. The first actual elaboration of the crown doctrine you get in 1613. Peter Revailly, who was the head of the crown guard at the time, says, the king always governs under the constraint of the crown, the nobility is equal before the crown and entitled to elect the king. Proto-democracy, equality of the subjects of the law. The nobility has rights against the king that the king must respect, or else the nobility will not respect the privileges of the king. In other words, this is about as liberal as you can get. This is way more liberal than any place else in the region, or frankly anywhere else in Western Europe at that point. And this is really Hungarian constitutional doctrine that you can do from original sources. Okay, so now my final demo. I have to stop. So I will just show you some really funny pictures because all of this says the crown, think about what this does in the context of this current authoritarian constitution. If they've got the crown in the preamble and the crown doctrine is forcible, it can overturn. Okay, so this is where I'm going. And so here's my final illustration for which you really need the picture. So here's the crown. Here's the funny thing about the crown. It actually consists of two parts. So one part is the part around the base, and the other are the cross pieces at the top. And how do we know that they're different parts? Well, the parts across the top have these little enamel portraits that look like this, in which the inscriptions are in Latin. So there's Peter, there's Paul, and they look like this. But if you look around the bottom of the crown, you get portraits that look like this, which have inscriptions in Greek, as in oops. What would a crown from Rome be doing with inscriptions in Greek? And the answer is it didn't come from Rome. The bottom of the crown is a Byzantine crown. And it was not Stephen's crown, actually, but it's still an 11th century crown, so it's extremely early. You can see, actually, and the two pieces were put together in some reference to each other, because on the left is the picture of Christ from the Greek crown, and on the right is the picture of Christ from the Latin crown. And it's very clear that they're copying one from the other. So they're trying to take the Byzantine crown and Latinize it, actually. Now,